You think those drive-through breakfast sandwiches and instant oatmeal packets can compete with what Grandma made from scratch? Think again. Cast iron skillets and wood stoves produced morning meals that modern convenience will never match. Let's dig into 60 old-fashioned breakfasts that still beat anything you can buy today. Vegetable juice cocktails offered a vibrant start to the day for families who embraced the fresh juicing craze of the 1960s. Homemade blends of carrots, celery, tomatoes, and leafy greens were touted as energizing tonics that delivered vitamins and minerals in every sip. Enthusiastic homemakers and health enthusiasts alike used sturdy kitchen juicers to create bright orange and green drinks that promised natural vitality and a refreshing lift before work or school. Nutrition columns in popular magazines highlighted these colorful cocktails as a way to boost immunity and cleanse the system, a concept that resonated with a generation seeking balance between modern convenience and natural living. Some households added a pinch of cayenne pepper or a splash of lemon juice to sharpen the flavor, while others preferred a milder blend for children. Served chilled in tall glasses with a sprig of parsley for garnish, vegetable juice cocktails became a stylish morning ritual that reflected the optimistic belief that good health could indeed be poured straight from the garden. Cottage cheese on toast with pineapple rings was the kind of retro breakfast you would find tucked inside those glossy 1970s women's magazines, always advertised as light, quick, and just fancy enough to feel like you tried. You would toast a slice of bread, scoop on some cottage cheese, and crown the whole thing with a pineapple ring straight from the can. It sounds odd now, but back then it was practical, filling, and passed off as health food, sweet, salty, creamy, and done in under 10 minutes, perfect for busy mornings or when groceries were running low. Housewives loved it for its simplicity, and teenagers liked it for being something different than plain old toast. You could find versions of this popping up at brunch tables, church socials, or just in quiet kitchens trying to stretch a meal. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of new diet trends and breakfast bars, but at the time, it was a fast, no-fuss meal that worked. Puffed rice cereal was shot from guns. That was not a joke. That was the actual slogan. And if that sounds dramatic, it is because cereal marketing in the mid-20th century was off the rails. You would open a tall tin can, yes, a literal metal can of cereal, and pour out a mound of puffed air disguised as breakfast. Puffed rice was bland, had the texture of packing peanuts, and got soggy 5 seconds after milk hit it. But kids ate it by the bowlful. Why? Because the name sounded dangerous and the commercials were wild. There was something thrilling about knowing your cereal had been blasted into existence with air cannons and then sealed in a tin like military rations. Plus, it made a great sound when it hit the bowl. The taste? Forgettable. But in a time when breakfast had to stretch and shelf life mattered more than flavor, puffed rice did its job. You could eat it dry, throw some sugar on top, or mix it with something else entirely. And for families who grew up on wartime habits and post-war marketing, it was a compromise that stuck around. But not everything from that era was dry or crunchy. Some breakfasts were warm, brown, and stirred in circles. Johnny cakes with sorghum syrup are just straight-up comfort food from a time when breakfast was this familial thing everybody looked forward to, and when breakfast was entirely made from scratch. Johnny cakes are these rustic little cornmeal pancakes that are actually very no-nonsense. None of the fluff, flair, and aesthetic charm you would normally associate with pancakes. Do you know that super cozy vibe they give off? Just not there this time. Johnny cakes are coarse, they're not the eBay when it comes to presentation, and they actually have this very deep, toasty corn flavor that pairs almost a little too well with the smokiness and richness of sorghum syrup. You can either use this in a dipping cup or drizzle it on top, but let's be real, the dipping cup is sacred. Anything else is blasphemy. Johnny cakes also have something of a history that goes back all the way to the indigenous peoples. They were the first ones to teach colonists how you handle cornmeal and how you should cook with it, and they were made to mirror the effects of other popular survivalist Native American food, such as pemmican. Its main function was lasting on long journeys and providing you with a boost of energy to carry on with your travels. Salted herring with potatoes is a dish that is built entirely on contrast. The briny meets the bland, and strong undertones meet soft aftertastes. The herring itself is something that's preserved in brine, right? So it's deeply flavored. It's firm when it comes to the flesh, it's slightly oily, and that tang isn't for everyone. But an honest-to-God seafood lover is going to enjoy the life out of it. The dish itself is something that's most commonly served cold, slightly warmed, or just with a side of elegant mashed potatoes. As elegant as they can be when they're made by a frustrated mom who just wants to get the table set up, really. A bit of chopped onion, sour cream, and dill, and you'll be remembering your mom's cooking soon enough. You know, salted herring with potatoes has always been something that's deeply considered a working-class regular, especially in the American Midwest and Northeast. It was so common to see this in coastal communities where fresh fish were always abundant. Preservation was something even kids could tell you about. Salted herring let families eat protein year-round, and potatoes were cheap and easy to grow, and they could be made into 1,000 different things. Cornbread stuffing waffles were the genius breakfast that repurposed leftover Thanksgiving prep into something completely new. Grandmothers took prepared cornbread stuffing and pressed it into hot waffle irons, creating crispy squares that were savory and herby. The waffle iron transformed the stuffing into something with crunchy exterior and tender interior, with herbs like sage perfuming every bite. These were topped with gravy, fried eggs, or cranberry sauce for those who loved sweet and savory combinations. The beauty was in the resourcefulness, turning what might have been wasted into creative breakfast. Families loved them because they tasted like Thanksgiving dinner but felt appropriate for morning. Children thought eating stuffing for breakfast was hilarious. Adults appreciated the protein and the crispy edges. The waffles could be made with leftover stuffing after Thanksgiving too, extending holiday flavors into the weekend. This breakfast proved that creativity in the kitchen knew no boundaries. Eggless pancakes. So the first time you hear that, you just automatically think that there's no real reason why these should exist because what's next? Brickless buildings? But really, eggless pancakes have been around for far longer than you would think. This is especially true for lean periods like the Great Depression or wartime rationing in the 1940s, and a lot of eggs back then were actually decently more expensive than people could afford, or they just weren't available because somebody who could afford them likely scooped most of them up. COVID-era bulk buying wasn't really an isolated event, I guess. Most recipes would essentially just rely on baking powder for the fluff and use some kind of oil or milk along with flour. Old-school versions, and I mean proper vintage recipes, would even include mashed bananas, vinegar, and some applesauce, and that's some proper veganism if you ask me. Eggless pancakes have largely faded into the background now, but they were definitely one of the most affordable meals our grandparents grew up with back in the day. Vienna sausages were not meant to be breakfast, but try telling that to someone who grew up opening a can of them before school. They were soft, salty, vaguely meat-like tubes packed in gelatinous goo. You would slice them up and fry them with eggs, or just eat them cold if time was tight. They were cheap, shelf-stable, and wildly popular in kitchens where making do was the motto. And you could not really tell what kind of meat they were made from, probably on purpose. But if your morning started with that slippery thwop of the can opening and the smell of brine hitting the air, you knew you were not getting pancakes. It was not glamorous, but it worked. Pair it with instant coffee and maybe some toast, and you had a meal. Sort of. Vienna sausages were part of a broader trend. Breakfast that was fast, filling, and required absolutely zero questions. And for those who remember the taste, the texture, or even just the tin can, you probably remember what came next too. A cereal so sugary it needed coffee just to balance it out. Maple syrup toast with warmed butter was the farmhouse kitchen's answer to rushed mornings when breakfast still needed to feel comforting, even if the fridge was nearly bare. You would toast a slice of bread, slather on warm butter, and drizzle real maple syrup over the top. That was it. Sweet, buttery, and ready in under 10 minutes. Families loved it because it was practical, made from pantry staples, and good enough to carry you through a long morning of chores, school, or factory work. Some folks added cinnamon, others kept it plain, but either way, it turned toast into something that felt a little indulgent. You could find versions of this in old rural cookbooks, passed down through generations of families who knew how to stretch groceries without cutting corners on comfort. Somewhere along the way, breakfast like this disappeared under the weight of boxed cereals and fast food menus. But back then, it was one of those quiet meals that actually made mornings bearable. Funny how something so simple could be so easy to forget. Cottage cheese pancakes delivered a high-protein, low-fat twist on a beloved breakfast classic, perfectly matching the 1960s fascination with lighter, figure-friendly meals. Cottage cheese was blended directly into the batter, adding creaminess and a gentle tang while reducing the need for extra butter or oil. The result was a tender pancake with a pleasantly rich flavor and a boost of calcium and protein that kept families satisfied well into the morning. Many home cooks served these pancakes with fresh berries or a drizzle of warm honey, while others paired them with a side of fruit compote for added color and natural sweetness. Nutrition writers often highlighted the recipe as a smart alternative to traditional flapjacks, and it became a favorite in health-conscious households across the country. Cottage cheese pancakes showed that a small shift in ingredients could transform a familiar dish into something both nourishing and exciting without sacrificing the comfort of a warm, homemade breakfast enjoyed around the kitchen table. Canned peach halves with cottage cheese was the quiet, no-cook breakfast that kept dieters, seniors, and busy families fed when time and groceries were both running low. You would grab a can of peach halves, spoon some cottage cheese in the center, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. Sweet, creamy, and filling enough to count, it showed up in weight loss guides, homemaker magazines, and community cookbooks promising simple, affordable meals. Parents loved it because it was fast and required no stove, and older folks leaned on it when cooking felt like too much work. It might sound odd now, but back then, canned fruit and cottage cheese were pantry staples that stretched far and kept mornings moving. Some versions added a drizzle of honey or chopped nuts, but most kept it plain, quick, and practical. It is one of those breakfasts that slipped away as frozen meals and grab-and-go options took over, but back then, it was quietly keeping families fed with nothing but a can opener and a spoon. Buttered saltine crackers with tea was not a snack. It was survival disguised as sophistication. You would take plain saltines, smear a bit of butter, or margarine if that is all you had, and pair it with a weak cup of tea. That was breakfast. No jam, no eggs, no sides, just crunch and steam. And somehow it worked. This was common in households where the bread ran out early and payday was still a few days away. But it did not feel like scraping the bottom. It felt intentional. A little quiet moment, sitting by the window with a tin of crackers and a chipped teacup. Sometimes, if you were lucky, the butter was soft. Other times it would tear the cracker in half and you would eat it in pieces. It was humble, yes, but not pitiful. That is the thing about old-school breakfasts. They stretched what little you had and made it count. Every bite was a memory. Every sip of lukewarm tea was a tiny reset button for the day ahead. But crackers were just the start. Some mornings, the real magic happened when last night's cornmeal was fried into gold. Hardtack might sound like a pirate snack, and honestly, you wouldn't be wrong. This rock-hard cracker was a staple for soldiers, sailors, and settlers alike. Anyone who needed food that could last months or even years. Made simply from flour and water, hardtack was famously tough to chew, earning nicknames like tooth duller and molar breaker. But here's where things got clever. To make this bland biscuit remotely edible, people would soak it in water, milk, or even coffee to soften it up. Now add a generous smear of honey or syrup, and suddenly you've got a sweet treat that feels like a luxury in hard times. Back in the day, honey was nature's candy, and drizzling it over softened hardtack transformed survival food into a breakfast comfort. So why did it disappear? Well, once fresher options and modern preservation methods came along, hardtack lost its charm. Plus, people today aren't exactly thrilled about eating something that requires pre-soaking unless it's oatmeal. Supermarkets brimming with fluffy pastries and freshly baked bread have pushed this once practical dish into just a figment of history. So fried cornmeal mush with syrup was this really golden, crispy edge throwback to times where meals like this counted as a wonderful breakfast. It was made from what was essentially just a chilled polenta, or otherwise known as cornmeal mush. You would slice these into thick slabs, pan-fry them until the outside was a complete crackling crust, and then the inside would stay really soft, dense, and creamy. Topping these with a bit of drizzle, sorghum and maple would complete the experience, and you would be enjoying a beautiful contrast of textures, flavors, and the crunchiness of it all. Cornmeal is a deeply hearty dish. It's something that sticks with you, and the nutty flavors help with that. This was a dish that was so common amongst Midwestern farm families and Southern homes throughout the 1800s and 1940s, and that was partially because cornmeal was so abundant that people just made up different versions of similar dishes. You will find it in old cookbooks, certain off-road diners that really try to stick to the whole mid-90s vibe, and Southern homes, but it's largely something that just doesn't get much traction anymore. Even still, cornmeal mush was amazing, and deserves to have its name in the Hall of Fame of easy, convenient breakfasts you can rely on. Turkey sausage and sage breakfast patties were the lighter alternative to pork sausage, bringing Thanksgiving flavors to the morning table. Grandmothers mixed ground turkey with fresh sage, thyme, black pepper, and sometimes maple syrup, forming the mixture into small patties. The patties were pan-fried in butter until golden brown, filling kitchens with the herbal aroma of sage. These tasted like Thanksgiving dressing in breakfast form, with sage providing that distinctive holiday flavor. Families appreciated the turkey option because it felt healthier while still being satisfying. The patties could be made ahead and reheated on Thanksgiving morning. They paired perfectly with eggs and toast. Adults who were health-conscious loved having a leaner protein option. Children often preferred these to regular sausage because the flavors were familiar. The sage and turkey combination became so associated with the holiday that eating them any other time felt wrong. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is really just make a bowl of cracked wheat cereal. Fatback and grits is pretty much something you would always identify as Southern comfort food. It's just something that's always been so heavily associated with the South, and that's for a good reason. Southern restaurants, families, churches, charity organizations, and a lot more have relied on this because it's just that good at what it does. You get an extremely soul-sustaining dish that's very popular in the rural South, and in farming communities, it's a gold mine. This is something that's also considered treasure among sharecroppers. But really, why is everyone putting all their stocks into this? Well, fatback was just an inexpensive and convenient way to preserve pork. And I mean seriously preserve it something that was this valuable of a protein source needed to go all the extra miles it could, and the people of America were all about making it last as long as possible. Grits would be made from ground hominy corn, and a lot of farmsteads and rural communities back then had their own practices of growing corn derived from Native American techniques and farming methods. Nowadays, fatback and grits just isn't something you see much in America anymore. But if you go for rustic, vintage Southern joints, you can find some authentic recipes. Most restaurants serve refined versions of this old classic now, though. So keep that in mind if you're looking to vlog a very faithful rendition of this dish. Oatmeal water porridge is something that sounds like it's ripped right out of a Depression-era cookbook, but that's only because it really is. It was supposed to be this zero-wastage dish that would inspire people to make the most out of the least, but it didn't really go past poor farming communities and immigrant-dense areas. What it was good for was digestion, though, because this was insanely light on the stomach, while also being really filling. So the parents that did know about this would make it obsessively for their children, and back then, kids were a lot more cool about putting up with oatmeal. It was also perfect sick person food. Plus, even if none of that applied to a person back then, they'd still probably be living paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes oatmeal helps when it's not payday yet. The point being that everyone had a run-in with this at some point, but only a select few communities made a thing out of it regularly. Oatmeal water porridge is just oats simmered in plain water too, so it makes sense why it didn't go too far in the broader world. You don't have milk, sugar, or any extras here. And it was pretty much the definition of what you would call frugal. It was used in times when dairy was really unavailable and money just wasn't there, and texture-wise, it's a lot thinner than you can imagine. All that to say, it's likely not the most appealing bite. Frosted Flakes with half and half was the breakfast of champions if your goal was to feel full until dinner. This was not your average milk and cereal situation. This was decadence disguised as routine. You would pour yourself a big bowl of Frosted Flakes, already sweet enough to power a third grader through gym class, and then drown it in half and half. Not milk, not cream, that luxurious middle ground where things got dangerously rich. The flakes would float, slowly losing their crunch as the thick liquid coated every surface. The first few bites felt like dessert, but by the bottom of the bowl, you were rethinking your life choices. Still, you knew you would do it again the next morning because it was just that good. First bite? Heavenly? Fifth bite? Questionable. But the sugar and fat combo made it weirdly addictive. It was the kind of breakfast that whispered, "You will regret this." But you did it anyway. And for many families, this was just how cereal was served, especially when whole milk was out and half was all you had left from Sunday dinner. It was resourceful. It was a little rebellious, and if you ever stood at the counter eating it straight from the mixing bowl while someone yelled at you to get ready for school, then congratulations. You lived. But cereal was not the only leftover fusion people created in the morning. Some families went full spaghetti sandwich. Baked bean toast was the quick, savory breakfast that filled countless plates across New England when mornings were rushed, but you still needed something hot and satisfying. You would toast a slice of bread, spoon on canned baked beans, maybe top it with cheese or butter, and slide it under the broiler. Breakfast was done in under 10 minutes, hearty enough to carry you through a long day. Families loved it because it was affordable, practical, and good enough to stretch one can of beans into a meal for the whole house. Old cookbooks, factory lunch guides, and frugal homemaker magazines all praised this trick for making mornings easy without giving up flavor. Some folks added mustard or hot sauce, others kept it plain, but either way, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly filled bellies when nothing else seemed to last. These days, it barely gets a mention, but back then, baked bean toast was one of those small comforts that made hard mornings feel bearable. Carrot raisin. Morning loaf became a beloved quick bread of the 1960s as families searched for ways to add vegetables into everyday meals without sacrificing sweetness or comfort. Grated carrots gave the loaf a vibrant orange color and moist texture, while plump raisins provided natural bursts of sugary flavor that needed little extra sweetener. Whole wheat flour or a blend of flours added fiber and a hearty crumb, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg filled kitchens with a cozy aroma as the loaf baked. Mothers loved how this bread delivered beta-carotene and vitamins in a form children eagerly devoured, often serving it lightly toasted with a thin spread of butter or cream cheese. Weekend brunches and after-school snacks alike benefited from slices of this cheerful loaf, which stayed tender for days and traveled well in lunchboxes. Carrot raisin morning loaf demonstrated the era's inventive approach to wholesome baking, turning simple pantry staples into a bright, nourishing treat that pleased everyone at the table. It looked like chocolate milk, but it definitely did not taste like it. Carnation Instant Breakfast came in little single-serve packets that promised energy, nutrition, and enough vitamins to power a small army. Just mix it with milk and boom, breakfast in under 30 seconds. For kids of the 1960s and 1970s, this was practically healthy food. Parents loved it because it was quick, kids tolerated it because it was chocolate-ish, and somewhere along the way it became a cultural artifact. Back then, convenience beat taste every time. If it came in a powder and looked remotely edible, it made it onto the breakfast table. The commercials promised vitality, strong bones, and something vaguely futuristic, like breakfast had become science. It was marketed as an ideal solution for busy mornings. But let's be honest, most of us drank it while staring at the same box of stale cereal we had been ignoring all week. And if you remember drinking it straight from a foggy glass while the milk never quite mixed right, you might be older than you think. But hey, if you thought that was strange, wait until you remember the orange powder astronauts brought to breakfast. Poached egg. Overstewed tomatoes was the kind of savory breakfast you would only find in old church cookbooks or handwritten recipe cards from a neighbor down the street. It was practical, filling, and ready in under 10 minutes, even if it sounded a little fancy. You would poach an egg, ladle some stewed tomatoes onto a plate, and serve it all with day-old biscuits or plain toast. The tomatoes were sweet and tangy, the egg added protein, and together they made breakfast that actually stuck with you through the morning. Families leaned on meals like this when money was tight and groceries were limited, especially during the Great Depression or lean years after the war. You did not need much: canned tomatoes, an egg, maybe some stale bread, and suddenly breakfast felt warm, filling, and just a little different than the usual toast. These meals disappeared as boxed cereals and frozen breakfasts took over, but back then it was one of the quiet ways people got through the morning with what little they had. Milk toast is also pretty much exactly what you think it is. Back in the old days, it was so much more common for people to take an intentionally frugal approach to how they spent their food, and especially the kind of hacks, snacks, and dishes they would come up with. All of these ideas were centered around being able to make the most using the least amount of time, energy, and ingredients possible. Milk toast is one of the best examples of that, because imagine if you tried to make the most out of some milk or some bread before it was about to hit those pearly gates and become fully expired. Yeah? You can't really figure out what to do, because while you'd normally just eat them on their own separately, this time that doesn't work. You just go ahead and get milk toast ready. The best part is that it works in 3 different ways. You get a nice healthy meal that's a pretty good breakfast or an interlude meal before your next big meal. You get to save money because you're not letting anything go to waste, nor are you buying something new because these ingredients are probably on their last legs, and you get a pretty lovely dessert out of it too. What's not to like, really? It's kind of insane how convenient milk toast can really be. Mutton sausages are these super earthy, super robust, and unapologetically meaty dishes that offer an entire world of flavor for those willing to traverse its savory depths. They're grounded until they are extremely coarse, and the chew is something that lets you know you're eating something with a lot of flavor in it. Speaking of flavor, this is something that strikes a lot of unique notes. It's grassy, a bit gamey, and extremely savory, but it's seasoned in a very different way. You have blends of parsley, garlic, pepperjack, allspice, even nutmeg in there. People would also make really traditional blends with things like rosemary, black pepper, garlic, and a bit of vinegar. When you would cook these, the fat would slowly render out, and this would baste the meat internally, making it an incredible flavor festival for meat lovers. Apple cider. French toast transformed ordinary breakfast bread into something that tasted like concentrated autumn. Grandmothers soaked thick slices of day-old bread in a mixture of eggs, apple cider, cinnamon, and vanilla, letting each piece absorb the liquid. The cider added natural apple sweetness and tang that regular milk couldn't provide. Cast iron griddles were buttered generously, then the soaked bread was laid down to cook slowly until golden brown. The bread puffed up as it cooked, creating custardy interiors. Served with butter and warm maple syrup, this breakfast felt celebratory and special. Families loved it because it used up bread that might otherwise go stale. The apple cider flavor connected breakfast to the season's apple-picking traditions. Children would request seconds and thirds, their plates sticky with syrup. Today's frozen French toast can't match this homemade version. Now, crust coffee soak, on the other hand, is something that is actually wondrous. It's a take on stale bread crusts, and I mean the little leftover bits that almost nobody likes eating, and the idea here is actually pretty interesting. You take those crusts, soak them in hot coffee, sometimes a dash of sugar and a splash of milk, and you actually end up reviving the stale bread crusts completely. It was a very bare-bones dish, don't get me wrong, but it was also surprisingly comfortable if you grew up with it. Think about all the other things you can do with this too, like coffee-soaked bread pudding. Although, if we're being realistic, it's definitely just survival food at its core. You might still find old people today who remember their grandparents making this dish for them, but largely speaking, it wasn't that much of a hit, but it was amazing at saving money and keeping your appetite quiet for just a little while longer. Leftover liver and onions for breakfast is the kind of thing that instantly tells you what generation someone is from. To many, it sounds like a punishment. To others, it was normal. Liver was cheap, nutritious, and widely available. Three things that mattered way more than taste. It came sliced, fried, and smothered in onions to soften both the texture and the blow. You might have had it for dinner the night before, and if there were leftovers, guess what was reheated in the skillet first thing in the morning? The smell alone was enough to clear a room. Metallic, meaty, and unmistakably intense. But it stuck to your ribs, and that was what mattered. Especially for working-class families or folks still shaking off Depression-era habits, liver and onions represented a kind of no-nonsense nourishment. And if you doused it in Worcestershire sauce or ate it with toast, you could almost convince yourself it was good. Almost. But if you ever woke up to that smell and thought, oh good, there's some left, then yes, you might be old. And if your breakfast was not liver, it might have come from the cold side of the fridge, swimming in syrupy nostalgia. Molasses milk with soda crackers. Sounds strange now, but for rural families and Depression-era kitchens, it was a fast, practical breakfast when the fridge was nearly bare. You would warm up some milk, stir in molasses for sweetness, and crumble soda crackers right on top. That was it. It was not fancy, but it filled you up, gave you a little energy, and made use of things that lasted forever in the pantry. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and packed with nutrients. Soda crackers were everywhere, and milk, fresh or canned, was always a breakfast staple. Old farm cookbooks, church recipe cards, and rural homemaker guides all had versions of this tucked inside, passed around by folks who knew how to stretch the simplest ingredients. It was humble, filling, and comforting in its own odd way. These days, it is almost unheard of, replaced by granola bars and cereal bowls. But back then, this quiet little breakfast got people through hard mornings with nothing but warm milk and a little ingenuity. Spinach and mushroom scramble turned a classic egg breakfast into a vibrant, vegetable-filled dish that matched the decade's growing interest in nutritious eating. Fresh spinach leaves were quickly wilted in a hot skillet, earthy mushrooms were sautéed until golden, and then beaten eggs were poured in to create a tender scramble flecked with greens. This hearty combination delivered iron, protein, and a savory depth of flavor that felt both rustic and sophisticated. Families appreciated that it required only a few simple ingredients while offering enough substance to keep everyone energized through school or work. Many homemakers added a small sprinkle of nutmeg or grated cheese to enhance the natural flavors, while health writers encouraged using olive oil instead of butter for a lighter touch. Served with a slice of whole grain toast or fresh fruit, the spinach and mushroom scramble quickly became a breakfast favorite for those who wanted something more exciting than plain eggs, but less indulgent than a rich omelet. It perfectly showcased how the 1960s embraced vegetables as stars of the morning table. Apple ring pancakes were straight out of those old Betty Crocker cookbooks and Sunday church potlucks that every neighborhood seemed to have. You would slice an apple into thick rings, dip them in pancake batter, and fry them up on the griddle. The result was a warm, fluffy pancake wrapped around sweet fruit, all ready in under 10 minutes. Kids loved them because it felt like dessert for breakfast, and parents loved them because they used what was already in the fridge. Apples were easy to keep on hand. Batter came together fast, and the whole thing cost next to nothing. Some folks dusted them with powdered sugar, others kept it plain, but either way, it was a breakfast that disappeared fast. These showed up everywhere, from rural farmhouses to suburban kitchens, quietly filling plates long before frozen waffles and toaster pastries took over. It is one of those breakfasts you do not hear about anymore. But back then, it was a reliable way to start the day. Sardines on toast. That is it. That was the breakfast. A few oily, salty fish laid out over a slice of dry toast, sometimes with mustard, sometimes with nothing at all. This was peak efficiency. Sardines came in little tins with pull tabs and olive oil, and once opened, there was no going back. You either learned to love them, or you left the room. But in many households, especially immigrant or coastal communities, sardines were normal. They were rich in protein, did not require refrigeration, and could be eaten cold. They slid out of the can like they were daring you to try them, and once you did, You either never looked back or never forgave your parents. The smell alone would hang in the kitchen like a stubborn ghost, and yet somehow they kept showing up on toast. Bonus points if you smashed them onto toast with a fork and added some black pepper or a squeeze of lemon. That was the deluxe version. For others, it was just fish and bread, plain and honest. Kids would gag. Grandparents would smile. And somewhere in the middle, someone would quietly eat their sardines and be grateful they were not powdered eggs again. It was not about flavor. It was about function. And if that sound of the tin peeling open still triggers memories, you know exactly what kind of breakfast we are talking about. But not every vintage morning started with toast and fish. Some of them started with hot soda, literally. I think the most intimate food experience for anyone from the South is easily just hominy grits. Like, these are definitely a Southern ride or die as far as breakfast is considered. Creamy, loaded with corn and customizable in about 1,000 different ways, there's a lot that hominy grits bring to the table that other dishes just don't seem to compare to. And that too on a budget. They're made from hominy, which is essentially just dried corn that's been treated with an alkaline solution and then grounded into coarse grits. And when cooked slowly with water, milk, and broth, they actually turn into this incredibly thick, fantastic porridge that's worth its weight in gold. What makes hominy grits really stand out is their sheer versatility, though. I mean, the possibilities are quite literally endless. You can go the savory route or the super sweet route, and all you have to do is just add a bit more of whatever spices, seasonings, and herbs you're working with. Hominy grits are so effective largely because they were a Native American creation. The tribes were making hominy a long time before any Europeans set foot on American soil, and they helped to popularize the tradition, which is how it turned into a go-to for Southern kitchens by the 19th century. Enough of all this savory stuff. Let's go towards something that's actually sweet. Believe it or not, people had incredible tricks and tips for that. One of those was a rice and molasses bowl, which is the kind of dish that just inspires gentle waves of nostalgia in you. It's something that's drizzled with thick, dark molasses. The molasses, which makes for a very bittersweet, smoky bite with sweet undertones, tends to seep into the grains. This actually gives them such a nice autumn-coated color that really just makes you want to set up your best sheet in a park, call a few friends, and enjoy the small things in life. Historically, though, this was nothing that was so romantic. It was a poor man's breakfast and dessert, especially in most parts of the South and the Appalachian regions. It was very common to see among working-class Northeasterns in the 18th century, and it was something that was relied on to stretch ingredients when things were running low. This is because molasses was always really cheap and bought in bulk, and if people weren't growing their rice, they were stocking up on as much as they could. Rice, molasses, and different kinds of bowls are now bygones of different times, but they were really good. Cranberry orange muffins were the tart sweet breakfast that balanced richer Thanksgiving morning dishes with bright, fresh flavor. Grandmothers baked these the night before Thanksgiving, using fresh cranberries that burst during baking and orange zest that perfumed the kitchen. The batter combined flour, sugar, eggs, and buttermilk into something tender and moist. Orange zest was grated directly into the mix, releasing oils that made every bite taste like citrus. The muffins baked until their tops domed and cracked slightly. A simple orange glaze was drizzled over the tops while still warm. These muffins were practical because they could be made ahead, freeing up oven space on Thanksgiving morning. Families grabbed them while rushing through preparations. The combination of tart cranberry and bright orange felt distinctly Thanksgiving. Today's bakery muffins can't match the real fruit flavor Grandma achieved. Lard biscuits are pretty much the heroes of old-school baking. If you actually look at it from a historical lens, these unapologetically flavorful biscuits have kept way more bellies full than something like turnips. No, but really, lard biscuits have been a generational safety net for when a hunger pang is about to turn a bad day into a bad week. Lard biscuits were the go-to in Southern kitchens for the longest time, even before butter became a staple ingredient in the area. Folks would keep tins of drippings on the stove, but most of the lard was preserved, not because people had to ration it or because they were running awfully short, but because they just liked it that much. Lard biscuits are something you don't see around anymore. But during several of the past few centuries, as well as notable periods like the Great Depression and the World Wars, lard biscuits were man's best friends. Sugar Smacks was not just cereal. It was barely cereal. It was more like candied puffs pretending to be nutritious, and somehow that was enough. If you remember pouring yourself a giant bowl of Sugar Smacks while your parents sat across from you sipping on straight black coffee, welcome to the Real Breakfast Club. The contrast was wild. You had a sugar explosion on one side of the table and bitter rocket fuel on the other. That was the vibe. Adults drank coffee because they were tired. Kids ate sugar cereal because it made the cartoons funnier. And sometimes, if your parents were really running behind, you would take a sip of their coffee out of curiosity and immediately regret it. No cream, no sugar, just punishment in a cup. But you would go back for more anyway, because somehow, the bitterness of the coffee balanced the ridiculous sweetness of the cereal. It made you feel older, like you belonged at the big table. That was the thing about breakfast back then. It was a weird mix of indulgence and grit. And if you remember tearing through a box of Sugar Smacks while sipping burnt diner coffee from your dad's chipped mug, you are not just old, you are vintage. But not every cereal was sugary. Some were practically gravel. Banana and wheat germ smoothies were the forgotten health food breakfast from the 1970s, back when nutrition guides promised energy in 10 minutes or less. You would blend a banana with milk, add a spoon of wheat germ, and maybe toss in honey if you had it. That was breakfast, quick, filling, and just trendy enough to feel like you were ahead of the curve. Parents loved it for being affordable, teens liked it for the simplicity, and health fads leaned hard on it as a protein-packed, no-fuss morning meal. It showed up in old diet books, homemaker columns, and those paper recipe handouts at grocery stores. Wheat germ was the health food of its time, promising fiber and nutrients without all the heavy cooking. Smoothies were new enough to feel exciting but easy enough to show up in every busy household. Somewhere along the way, this breakfast got lost behind flashy protein powders and complicated smoothie bowls, but back then, it quietly kept families full with nothing but fruit, milk, and a blender. Rice pudding. Breakfast bowls turned yesterday's leftover rice into a gentle, creamy start to the day, reflecting the 1960s love for resourceful cooking. Cold rice was simmered slowly with milk until tender and thick, sweetened lightly with honey or brown sugar, and perfumed with vanilla or a sprinkle of cinnamon. The result was a warm, comforting bowl that combined the heartiness of a grain with the softness of a custard, perfect for chilly mornings or quiet weekends. Parents appreciated how this dish minimized waste while providing lasting energy and natural sweetness without relying on processed cereals. Many families topped their bowls with raisins, toasted almonds, or fresh berries for added flavor and nutrition, making each serving unique and colorful. Rice pudding breakfast. Bowls offered an affordable, nourishing way to stretch ingredients while still feeling indulgent, proving that a simple pot on the stove could transform leftovers into a wholesome breakfast treat that pleased both children and adults seeking comfort and warmth. Soft-boiled egg with buttered soldiers was the breakfast shortcut every British American household swore by when time was tight, but comfort still mattered. You would soft-boil an egg, slice toast into thin strips called soldiers, and dip them right into the runny yolk. Breakfast done in under 10 minutes, warm, filling, and good enough to start even the busiest day. It was simple, practical, and everywhere in old cookbooks that cared more about frugality than fancy plating. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries ran low, but everyone still needed something protein-packed and fast. Kids loved it for the dipping, parents loved it for the speed, and it quietly filled countless tables from the 1930s through the 70s. Somewhere along the way, soft-boiled eggs and buttered soldiers disappeared under frozen waffles and drive-through breakfasts. But back then, it was one of those small, satisfying meals that made mornings a little easier. Hot Dr. Pepper was real. It was not a prank. It was not a joke. It was an actual breakfast drink, served warm, with a slice of lemon floating on top like it belonged there. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Dr. Pepper Company rolled out ads urging families to heat their soda in a saucepan and drink it like tea. And people did. They poured it into mugs, called it comforting, and sipped it alongside eggs and toast like this was totally normal. There was something oddly cozy about sipping soda that steamed like coffee, even if it tasted like fizzy syrup trying to be sophisticated. It was part science experiment, part nostalgia bomb. One sip, and you were either delighted or deeply confused. It smelled like caramelized chemicals and tasted like soda-flavored syrup with a citrus twist. Kids loved it, adults tolerated it, and on cold winter mornings, it hit the spot, mostly because you had no idea what else to serve. The lemon slice added a whiff of class, even though the whole idea screamed experimental chemistry. If you ever walked into a kitchen that smelled like a candy factory was melting, chances are someone had a pot of soda on the stove. And if that was your idea of a warm beverage, then you are probably still wondering why it disappeared. But hot soda was not the only strange liquid to hit the breakfast table. Some folks poured something even weirder into a glass and called it a meal. Applesauce bread is essentially what you think it is. This super cozy, sweet-smelling loaf of bread works wonders, and it makes your entire kitchen feel like an advertisement for autumn, but right in the middle of April. It's soft, really moist, and spiced just right so that it's not really overwhelming, but you can definitely pick up on those cinnamon and nutmeg notes. A bit of clove here and there also does wonders for the dish. The applesauce is something that keeps it really tender without needing a lot of butter or soil, and this is, to be honest, most of the point. It was a go-to during the 30s and 40s, especially in wartime kitchens where fat and eggs were pretty much rationed. Applesauce was really cheap. It was something that was easy to get at home, it doubled as a sweetener and a binder, and it ended up being perfect for cakes, breads, and cookies. Flavor-wise, it's something that you could call a mixture of banana bread and spice cake, so it's not too sugary, but it feels rich enough that you can definitely call it a dessert. The liver and onions breakfast fry is a strong, unapologetic dish that comes at you with iron, fat, and attitude, which is what the morning needs. Liver slices, practically always beef or pork, are lightly floured and pan-fried, just shy of crunchy on the outside. Tender on the inside, it's all liver, undeniably. Rich, metallic, slightly sweet, extremely savory. Soft onions, caramelized along with or sautéed separately in the same skillet, add a sweetness that balances all that intensity. Often deep-fried in bacon grease or lard, the whole plate is smoky and salty, the depth of flavor more medicinal than indulgent. Some versions add eggs or grits on the side, but the liver and onions are the point. Protein-forward, greasy. It's something that's undeniably as rustic as it is protein-filled. If you like spending your Saturday morning riding the Meat Express to flavor heaven, then this is definitely a dish for you. Historically, though, this was a meal that people ate when they really needed fuel for all the digging, shoveling, and hauling of the day. Liver was something you could get for a dime a dozen from local butcher shops, and everybody wanted to take advantage of that fact. Pecan pie overnight oats gave busy Thanksgiving cooks something healthy that could be grabbed from the refrigerator without any morning effort. Grandmothers combined rolled oats with milk, brown sugar, chopped pecans, cinnamon, and vanilla in mason jars the night before. The mixture sat in the refrigerator overnight, with the oats absorbing liquid and softening into creamy porridge. In the morning, the jars were topped with extra pecans and maple syrup. The beauty was in the convenience and the fact that everything was made ahead. Families could eat breakfast at different times as people woke up. The flavor was familiar and comforting, connecting breakfast to the pecan pie that would appear later. Health-conscious relatives appreciated having something with oats and nuts. Children enjoyed eating from their own individual jars, feeling grown up. This breakfast represented modern convenience applied to traditional flavors. Ham and red-eye gravy is something that's considered a Southern classic. It has a really bold, salty personality, and it's a very no-nonsense flavor profile as well. This is a dish that takes country ham, which is typically dry-cured and goes the pan-frying route. The idea is to fry it until you see those dark brown edges crisping up in the pan. After that, you get an incredible flavor explosion in the form of concentrated pork drippings, and these then take a further unexpected turn. You start to pour in strong black coffee. Now I know you're about to fast forward 10 seconds, but hear me out, okay? The result isn't creamy or thick like you would expect. The coffee ends up deglazing the pan and it creates this super thin reddish-brown gravy that has an unmistakable sheen to it. The result is a punchy, smoky, and bitter-tasting gravy, but not overwhelmingly bitter, and the coffee cuts through a lot of the richness of the ham fat. This is something you would see so commonly among rail workers in Tennessee and Alabama, especially if it was in the afternoon hours. The caffeine really helped with the job. Hot water fried cornmeal cakes are an old-school Southern staple that don't really get even half the love and attention they should these days. I just want you to visualize a crispy, golden brown cornmeal cake with the most incandescent exterior you've ever seen, and then a tender, soft center that just leaves you wanting more and more. But it's natural, and even good, to get curious. And when you hear hot water fried anything, your first instinct is to immediately go like, wait, what? And I really wouldn't blame you. The practice of making cornmeal cakes this way is something that actually goes back several centuries, right back to the enslaved African Americans in the South who were making the first versions of these. Without access to proper feed, not even leavening, they found a way to make do with just cornmeal and water, and these were also known by a much more popular name, hoe cakes. Now, in the end, they started to fall out of everyone's go-to cooking preferences, but I think cornmeal cakes have one more comeback in them, despite it all. Grape Nuts was not a cereal. It was a challenge, a bowl of hard, crunchy nuggets that felt more like punishment than breakfast, unless you knew the trick. You had to soften them with hot water. That was the secret. Pour it in, let it sit, and wait. If you were impatient, you would regret it. Teeth were lost to Grape Nuts. It was dense, it was earthy, and it never pretended to be fun. But for a generation raised on rationing and stretching every dollar, Grape Nuts had value. It was filling. It was affordable. And it lasted forever in the pantry. You could mix in some sugar, a splash of milk, maybe a bit of cinnamon if you were feeling fancy. But most days, it was just water and hope. Kids today would call it cardboard. Back then, it was considered hearty. And the weird thing is, some people actually liked it that way. Especially when the weather was cold and the house was quiet. A warm bowl of Grape Nuts felt kind of grounding. Not exciting, not delicious, just real. But sometimes, when you were lucky or just ran out of options, breakfast came straight from the fridge and straight from dessert. Leftover biscuit with syrup or gravy drizzle was one of those Depression-era breakfasts that made sure nothing ever went to waste. You would take yesterday's biscuit, stale or not, reheat it, and pour canned gravy or a drizzle of syrup over the top. Suddenly, leftovers became breakfast in under 10 minutes. Families leaned on meals like this when the cupboards were bare and payday felt a long way off. It was not fancy, but it filled your belly and kept mornings moving. Syrup sweetened things up, gravy made it savory, and both stretched the little bit of food you had into something satisfying. Farmhouses, boarding houses, even factory kitchens knew this trick by heart. You could find it tucked away in old homemaker guides and church recipe swaps, quietly keeping people fed when groceries were scarce. Some meals disappeared quietly, but back then, this one carried families through lean times with nothing but yesterday's bread and a little creativity. Banana wheat germ smoothies highlighted the superfood status of wheat germ during the 1960s, when Americans became fascinated with nutrient-dense ingredients that promised energy and vitality. Ripe bananas blended smoothly with milk, wheat germ, and a drizzle of honey, creating a naturally sweet drink packed with protein, fiber, and essential vitamins. Early adopters of home blenders loved how quickly they could create a filling breakfast that tasted indulgent while staying true to the health trends of the era. Some adventurous families added a spoonful of peanut butter or a pinch of cinnamon for extra flavor, while others used yogurt instead of milk to boost creaminess and probiotics. This smoothie was particularly popular with teenagers and young athletes who wanted a portable, energizing meal before school or practice. Banana wheat germ smoothies perfectly represented the optimism of the decade, offering a convenient and wholesome way to start the morning that felt modern and nourishing all at once, without the need for refined sugars or processed mixes. Wheat germ and yogurt bowls were the health kick of the 1970s that snuck their way into forgotten cookbooks and quick breakfast guides. You would scoop some plain yogurt into a bowl, toss on a spoonful of wheat germ, maybe drizzle honey or sprinkle nuts if you had them, and breakfast was done in minutes. It was quick, packed with protein, and felt ahead of its time back when most breakfasts were still sugar-heavy cereals or toast. The health-conscious crowd loved it because it kept you full. Parents liked it because it was easy. And even the kids got on board, mostly because the yogurt cut through the plain, nutty taste of wheat germ. These bowls were everywhere in the 70s, showing up in homemaker magazines, diet guides, and those community cookbooks with spiral bindings. But like a lot of forgotten breakfasts, they slipped away when trends shifted. Now it is all smoothie bowls and protein shakes. Butter was a luxury. Margarine was suspicious. But bacon grease? That was breakfast gold. If you had a metal canister on the stove filled with congealed fat and a strainer on top, you already know where this is going. Toast with bacon drippings was a rite of passage. Crispy white bread smeared with yesterday's leftover lard, sometimes sprinkled with salt, sometimes just eaten as is. It was smoky, greasy, and completely satisfying. And back then, no one cared about saturated fats or cholesterol levels. The grease was recycled like liquid currency. Families kept it in old coffee tins or jelly jars, and if you ever scooped a thick glob of solid bacon fat onto toast and watched it melt into the bread like butter from another planet, then yes, you might be old. This was fuel for a long day, and it came with that unmistakable aroma that clung to your clothes long after the plate was clean. You did not waste anything. That was the rule. If you had bacon, you kept the grease. If you had grease, you made toast. And if you were really lucky, you had something even fancier waiting in the freezer. It came in a yellow box, and all you had to do was Lego. So a peanut butter molasses sandwich is pretty much as good as it gets. It's old-school lunchbox energy, and it's sticky, sweet, and salty. It's pretty much made to power you through the day on a mostly low-key budget, and it's also exactly what it sounds like. This is a very hearty smear of peanut butter, and it's usually something that's layered with a drizzle of molasses on plain sandwich bread. Molasses tend to add this really deep, smoky sweetness that's a lot more intense than any kind of honey or jelly, and the peanut butter essentially rings the salt and fat. This makes it really well balanced and filling, and the sandwich shows up a lot more during times when economic crises were your average Tuesday. I'm talking about periods like the Depression and the middle part of the 1940s, where even an egg was not really promised to you. This was especially true for people in working-class homes. Peanut butter was something that people loved because it was really heavy in protein and dense, and it would work more often than not with molasses. The boldness and earthy sweetness of molasses actually bounced off really well with the richness of the peanut butter, and it's not a light sandwich at all. Buckwheat porridge is a dish that screams warm and umami. It has a very nutty backbone, and it has an incredibly rustic flavor profile. If you cook this slowly, the buckwheat groats start to absorb water and the milk. The end result is this ultra-divine, thick porridge that's really filling, deeply satisfying, and just what you need after a hard day of work. Its texture is something that's a lot coarser than oatmeal, it's a lot chewier, it's more toothsome, and it has a rich and bitter flavor that makes it stand out from softer kinds of breakfast grains. Unsweetened, it's a bit less robust. It leans towards savory more than it does to anything complex, flavor-wise. Sweeten it with molasses, honey, or brown sugar, though, and you get an entirely different picture. Vividly smoky, deeply sweet, and just the right kind of warm, it becomes this ideal comfort food that restores your spirit and gets you ready for your day. Buckwheat porridge has always been something people have used like that, to just get themselves on their feet when they don't feel like making anything else, and I think it's time to bring the tradition back for all grain enthusiasts. Cornmeal Johnny cakes with honey butter were the rustic breakfast that connected Thanksgiving morning to America's earliest cooking traditions. Grandmothers mixed stone-ground cornmeal with boiling water, salt, and sugar, creating a thick batter that was spooned onto hot griddles greased with bacon fat. The cakes cooked until golden brown and crispy at the edges. These weren't fluffy like modern pancakes, but dense and satisfying. The honey butter was whipped by hand, combining softened butter with honey. Families served these on Thanksgiving morning as a nod to Native American foodways and the first Thanksgiving story. The cakes were filling and economical, using cornmeal that was cheaper than wheat flour. Adults appreciated their heartiness. The simplicity felt appropriate for Thanksgiving, reminding everyone that gratitude started with basic sustenance. Today's instant pancake mixes can't replicate the authentic corn flavor. Stewed tomatoes on bread were something created out of thrift necessity, but they ended up being such a massive comfort food for the people that they stuck around. Tomatoes are often canned, right? That didn't used to be a thing until like the 60s, and that's why people really wanted to try out this new variant of tomatoes. They were slow-cooked, fresh with onion, butter, and bacon fat. Some people would go the extra mile, add a bit of sugar and salt, sometimes a hint of spice and vinegar, or take on a really rich and slightly sweet flavor. As these would tend to simmer, they would soften into this thick, chunky sauce that was kind of juicy but not really watery, and it had a really nice acidity to it. It helped that whatever flavors were there would cling really hard to the tomatoes. The simmering process would help them soften into this thick, chunky sauce too, and it went wild with white bread or cornbread. The bread was perfect for absorbing all of that up like a sponge, and that's what made this such a staple throughout the Depression and throughout a lot of the southern areas. Tomatoes are something that nobody ever really runs out of, and stewing them on bread is something that's a forgotten classic for getting through a hungry day. Before butter became the reigning toast topper, our frugal forebears embraced something a bit more rustic like rendered animal fat smeared across toasted bread. Whether it was pork lard, beef tallow, or even goose fat, this golden spread was the original zero-waste culinary move. After frying up bacon or roasting meats, no one dared throw away the precious fat. Instead, they'd strain and save it, turning it into a savory, energy-packed breakfast boost. Some would sprinkle a pinch of salt, herbs, or if you were feeling fancy, even a touch of sugar to balance the richness. Back then, animal fat wasn't just a cooking byproduct. It was a prized resource, especially during lean times. For rural families and urban laborers alike, it provided essential calories to power through physically demanding days. But as refrigeration, vegetable oils, and dairy products became widespread, rendered fat slowly slid off the breakfast menu. Health trends also played a part. The low-fat craze of the late 20th century practically demonized it. Today, while foodies are rediscovering nose-to-tail cooking and chefs are reviving schmaltz and drippings for flavor-packed dishes, rendered fat on morning toast remains mostly a culinary ghost. Still, it's a fascinating reminder of a time when nothing went to waste, and breakfast was as much about survival as it was about satisfaction. Meatloaf with ketchup for breakfast was not a treat. It was a necessity. A cold, dense slab of last night's dinner, sliced and slapped onto a plate, or sandwiched between two slices of bread if you were running late. You might add more ketchup, you might not. It depended on your tolerance for dry meat and your level of morning optimism. Meatloaf was the ultimate leftover. It held its shape, kept its flavor, and was somehow better cold. Maybe because you did not have to smell it cooking again. Maybe because you were too tired to care. There was something rugged and unapologetic about it, like you were fueling up for a day of manual labor, even if you were just headed to school. It was the kind of breakfast that made you feel tough, even if it came wrapped in a napkin. But for many households, meatloaf breakfast meant you were not going hungry. It had protein, it had carbs, and it had a taste that clung to your mouth until lunch. Kids would groan, dads would nod approvingly, and moms would say, "There's food in the fridge," like that was the end of the conversation. If you ever ate meatloaf off a paper towel while staring at the microwave and trying to decide if it was worth heating up, then you know the drill. Skipping dinner after a heavy lunch was one of the oldest tricks in the diet book, and it stuck around because it was easy to disguise. Eat big at noon, pick at a salad by 6, or better yet, nothing. The phrase, "eat like a king at breakfast, a prince at lunch, and a pauper at dinner," was passed around like gospel. Housewives followed it religiously, packing lunchboxes with real food while saving nothing for themselves later. Some would claim they weren't hungry. Others blamed the heat. But more often than not, dinner was skipped on purpose. It was not starvation, it was strategy. By eating early and stopping completely, you bought a sense of control. And when the stomach growled at bedtime, that just meant the diet was working. It became a quiet habit. You fed everyone else. You cleaned the plates. And then you poured a glass of water, sat down, and told yourself that full bellies did not belong to you. Not tonight. Peanut butter and honey milkshakes were the quick breakfast booster you would find in every 1960s teen handbook or homemaker guide promising energy in minutes. You would toss peanut butter, milk, and honey into a blender, give it a good mix, and breakfast was done before you could even finish your coffee. It sounds simple now, but back then it was practical, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. Parents loved it because it was affordable and kept teenagers full, and teenagers loved it because it tasted like dessert for breakfast. Some folks added ice or fruit if they had extra, but the basic recipe stayed the same. Peanut butter for protein, honey for sweetness, and milk to bring it all together. It showed up in old cookbooks, school lunch suggestions, and quick breakfast guides long before protein shakes and energy drinks filled grocery aisles. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of modern trends, but back then, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly got families through rushed mornings with nothing but pantry staples and a blender. Maypo was the hot cereal you either begged for or had to be bribed into eating. It came in a tin with a little cartoon boy on the front. "I want my Maypo," a slogan that somehow made bland maple mush sound exciting. But Maypo was not just food, it was part of the morning ritual. You would stir the mix into hot milk, trying to keep the clumps down, while the house still smelled like someone forgot toast in the oven. For many families, this was a warm and filling meal in the middle of a cold winter, and you would eat it while bundled in flannel pajamas, watching condensation fog up the windows. It was sweet, but not too sweet. A cousin of oatmeal, but somehow both smoother and stranger. And for some kids, it was the only hot thing on the menu before heading off to school. But if you stuck a pat of margarine in the middle and waited for it to melt into a tiny golden crater, you know exactly what I am talking about. That was breakfast. And if hot cereal does not do it for you, maybe you were more of a meat and eggs person. Not bacon, though. Something far less polite. If your leftovers happen to be potatoes, mashed or otherwise, then potato cakes are your hero for today's Saturday dinner. Potato cakes are the ultimate leftover glow-up, and they're a fine example of how putting a little bit of faith, time, and creativity into what you think is nothing that special can actually result in a killer dish. Potato cakes are made from mashed potatoes that have been mixed with a generous bit of flour, egg, and then shaped into patties until they're golden brown. Just think of them like hash browns, or at least like a distant but more nostalgic and comfier cousin of hash browns. The flavor is what you would expect, but it's honestly more buttery than you would think, too. You're really going to have the time of your life if your original mashed potatoes that are left over were made with cream or garlic mixed in, but even if they weren't, that's always a step you can add later. Potato cakes were the gift of several immigrant communities that were putting down roots during the 1800s and 1900s. This is a dish that's been shared among Irish, German, and Polish families, so everybody has their own take on it, and I know boxed mashed potatoes and freezer meals are what everyone goes for today. But this still beats all of that. Stewed dried apples are something that smell like an old kitchen in the middle of fall. I'm talking about warm colors, scents, spices, and fruity notes galore. The apples are leathery slices, but you can also cut them up into the shape of rings for some extra visual flair. They get simmered really slowly in water, and when they plump back to life, they start to go really tender. These are super chewy at their core, and sugar, cinnamon, or just a little bit of clove will give them that extra weight they're missing. Stewed dried apples have been a pantry essential across many centuries, but particularly the 19th century in Southern America. That's because drying apples was the most standard way of keeping them all right before refrigeration came along. Pumpkin bread pudding with bourbon sauce was the decadent breakfast that blurred the line between morning meal and dessert. Grandmothers cubed day-old bread and soaked it in a custard mixture of eggs, cream, pumpkin puree, cinnamon, and nutmeg overnight. The pudding baked until puffy and golden. The bourbon sauce was made by melting butter with brown sugar and a generous splash of bourbon, creating a rich glaze. The combination was intensely flavorful, with pumpkin providing earthiness and bourbon adding warmth. This breakfast was reserved for adult gatherings or late-morning brunches. Families loved it because it used up stale bread while creating something luxurious. The bourbon was optional but traditional, giving the dish a grown-up edge. Adults would linger over second helpings, their coffee cups refilled multiple times. This breakfast represented indulgence and celebration, perfect for holidays when rules could be bent. Lastly, after you've polished off your toast with a hearty smear of rendered fat, what's next? Well, you'd reach for a steaming bowl of hasty pudding, the breakfast MVP of the thrifty kitchen. Made from humble cornmeal, this quick-cooked mush was beloved in early American kitchens for being fast, filling, and fantastically versatile. Colonial cooks simply boiled cornmeal with water or milk until thick and creamy, then topped it with a drizzle of molasses, honey, or even a bit of leftover fat for extra richness. Think of it as the rustic cousin of modern-day polenta or cream of wheat, but with frontier grit. Hasty pudding got its name for good reason. It was a no-fuss dish that came together in minutes, making it perfect for hard-working families who didn't have time for elaborate breakfasts. It filled bellies and fueled long days of labor on farms, in factories, and at sea. But over time, as breakfast menus became fancier and quicker convenience foods flooded the market, hasty pudding fell out of favor. If you ever ate pie while standing in front of the fridge with a spoon and a guilty conscience, then welcome home. But not every shortcut was sweet. Some were warm, brown, and brewed from desperation. Postum was not coffee, it just looked like it was. For many families, it was the hot beverage of choice, especially when actual coffee was too expensive or frowned upon for kids. Made from roasted grains and molasses, Postum was marketed as the wholesome, caffeine-free alternative. And somehow people bought into that. You would stir a spoonful into hot water and try to convince yourself it tasted like something grown-ups would drink. It had this deep, earthy flavor that hovered somewhere between toasted bread and boiled pencil shavings. Not terrible, just different. And when paired with a piece of dry toast, it became a breakfast that felt oddly noble. You were not indulging. You were starting the day with restraint. Postum was the drink of war years, depression years, and anyone trying to avoid caffeine jitters. It was the beverage equivalent of "we make do." And if you sipped it from a chipped mug while flipping through the newspaper or stared out the window while steam fogged your glasses, then you get it. That kind of quiet breakfast was not rare. It was routine. But when even bread was running low, folks had to get creative with what they spread, or did not spread, on top. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was about as classic as breakfast could get. Quick oats simmered on the stove, topped with a spoonful of brown sugar and a splash of canned milk. It was ready in 10 minutes flat, cheap to make, and warm enough to shake off the worst winter mornings. Families across America leaned on this breakfast when budgets were tight, but everyone still needed something filling to start the day. Quick oats cooked faster than traditional oats, brown sugar gave just enough sweetness, and canned milk made the whole thing creamy even if fresh milk was hard to come by. It showed up in school lunch guides, frugal homemaker magazines, and those old cookbooks buried at the back of every kitchen drawer. For a lot of folks, this was not a special occasion breakfast. It was the daily routine, quiet, dependable, and gone in under 10 minutes. Funny how something so ordinary could disappear so completely, replaced by instant packets and flashy coffee shop menus. Peanut butter and apple. Open-faced sandwiches delivered a satisfying blend of protein, natural sweetness, and crunch, making them an ideal school morning breakfast in the 1960s. Thick slices of whole grain bread were toasted lightly, spread with creamy peanut butter, and topped with crisp apple slices for a refreshing contrast of textures. Parents loved how this simple combination kept children full and energized through long school days while also providing vitamins and minerals without relying on sugary spreads. Magazines promoted it as a smart choice for busy families, and many households customized it with a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of cinnamon for a cozy touch. The sandwich could be assembled in minutes, yet looked appealing enough to serve at casual brunches with friends, reflecting the era's appreciation for healthy convenience. Peanut butter and apple. Open-faced sandwiches captured the straightforward creativity of 1960s breakfasts, proving that a few wholesome ingredients could come together to create a meal that felt both comforting and forward-thinking every single morning. If you have ever stood in front of a stove flipping cornmeal slices while the rest of the house was still dark, then you already know. This was comfort food with calluses. But sometimes, breakfast took a hard left turn into the bizarre, like when eggs were not enough. So you added ketchup. There is no middle ground with ketchup on scrambled eggs. You either grew up with it or you think it is culinary heresy. But for millions of American kids, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, it was just how breakfast worked. Eggs were cheap, ketchup was everywhere. Put the two together and you had a meal that felt familiar, even if it looked like something from a preschool food fight. This was not about haute cuisine, it was about speed and taste. Kids loved it because ketchup made everything taste like a hot dog. Parents loved it because it kept the complaining to a minimum. And let us be honest, these were not fluffy French omelets. These were dry, overcooked eggs tossed in a pan until they barely held together. The ketchup gave them life. It also gave them color, which was important in a decade where most food was beige. Some folks even added it to fried eggs or egg sandwiches, claiming it just worked. And if you still do it today, no judgment. Nostalgia is powerful stuff. But ketchup was not the only flavor booster in town. Sometimes, you needed something with a bit more iron. Jelly roll-ups on white bread were the quick breakfast treat every kid from the 1950s to the 70s knew by heart. You would flatten a slice of white bread, spread on a little jam, roll it up tight, and slice it into pinwheels. Breakfast was done in under 10 minutes, fun to eat, and easy enough that even kids could make their own. Families leaned on meals like this when mornings were rushed, but you still needed something sweet to start the day. It was a trick you would find in lunchbox guides, homemaker columns, and those old spiral-bound cookbooks hiding in every kitchen drawer. Some folks added peanut butter, others kept it plain with jelly. But either way, it turned bread and jam into a quick, cheerful breakfast that actually stuck with you. Somewhere along the way, roll-ups disappeared under cereal boxes and toaster pastries. But back then, it was one of those small, forgotten meals that made mornings just a little brighter. Now, parsnip hash is a sweet, savory dish that boggle your mind. Because what really does parsnip hash entail? It's a sweet and savory skillet dish that smells a lot like summer and tastes like something that just came out of a wood-fired stove. Parsnips were diced, fried, and they turned golden at the edges. The idea was to caramelize them until they were just about to be overcooked, because there's this really specific sweet spot between overcooked and just typically caramelized where the flavor gets super concentrated. The end result was a nutty, peppery, and sweet dish that was honestly to die for. If you're looking for something healthy to add to your diet, this is also a wonderful option. And historically speaking, it's always been something people ate throughout the winter to keep their health strong, their immune system locked in, and their bellies full. Some people definitely prefer things completely vegetarian, and this is a pretty amazing way to go about it. If you're looking for some inspiration for your meal plan, then there's no better or healthier dish to start out with than turnip hash. Also, if you do end up trying this, you absolutely have to share the experience in the comments. I'm low-key dying to know what turnip hash is like. Cinnamon toast with broiler crisp was one of those forgotten 10-minute breakfasts that once felt fancy, even though it came straight from the bread box. You would take a slice of white bread, butter it generously, sprinkle it with sugar and cinnamon, and slide it under the broiler until the top bubbled and crisped. That was it. No pancake mix, no waffle irons, just the broiler and a little patience. Kids loved it because it felt like dessert. Parents loved it because it was fast, and everyone loved it because it used pantry staples. During the Great Depression and even into the 70s, families relied on simple breakfasts like this to stretch groceries without giving up flavor. The sugar caramelized on top, the bread toasted just enough, and suddenly plain breakfast felt like a treat. You could find versions of it in old community cookbooks, school recipe cards, even homemaker magazines. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of frozen waffles and cereal boxes. Cold spaghetti on white bread was not a recipe. It was survival. Leftovers from the night before, dumped onto a slice of soft white bread, folded in half, and eaten without shame. This was not about presentation. This was about hunger and efficiency. The spaghetti, sauced, cold, and clumped, was pulled straight from the fridge. No reheating, no fork, just slap it onto bread and go. It was messy, it was awkward, and it was weirdly satisfying. It was one of those meals that made no sense but hit all the right notes when you were broke, tired, and 10 minutes late. Even the sauce-stained fingers felt like part of the experience. The white bread acted as a sponge, soaking up the tomato sauce and turning it into something between a sandwich and a science project. For working-class families, this kind of breakfast was common. You did not waste food. You did not ask questions. You just ate what was there and got out the door. And spaghetti sandwiches were portable. You could eat them while walking, driving, or hiding from judgmental siblings. If you have ever seen marinara dripping onto a math worksheet, you know what I mean. This was not breakfast, it was a decision. And if you have ever had to double up the bread just to keep the noodles from escaping, then you probably also remember the other leftover king of the fridge, the meatloaf. Boiled barley porridge is one of those breakfasts that just feels like a pat on the back from a mentor, a hug from your best friend, or a call from your grandparents asking you to come over and try some of that breakfast you always love. It's also something that's built to last you at least until the middle of the day. You make boiled barley porridge by simmering hulled or pearl barley into water and milk, and then you get a soft, creamy texture that almost melts in your mouth. Flavor-wise, though, it's pretty nutty and kind of similar to oatmeal. You get a chewer bite and a bit more earthiness out of this, but it soaks up almost any kind of syrup or liquid you throw at it, as well as spices. That's a big part of why this dish is as flavorful as it is. We're talking about some serious ancient history when we discuss its origins, though, like this is the kind of thing that goes way further back, to the times of the Romans and medieval peasants. In the United States, it's something that was popular first in rural areas and immigrant homes, but each country has its own history with barley. Mutton fat bread is something that's unapologetically itself. It's too rich, too deep, and it has all the meaty flavors you could ask for. The essence of rendered sheep fat is unmistakable here. It's something that goes perfectly well with day-old bread, slightly dry, a bit hard, and coarse. You know, the entire 9 yards. This is as rustic of a dish as it gets. It absorbs the hot fat in this dish and it crisps on the outside while getting extremely soft on the inside. This dish is something that you would see really commonly whenever you would pass by factory towns or farms. Especially among rural laborers, such as people in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were sheep farming regions like the Appalachia, Wales, or the Highlands, and mutton fat was an extremely common ingredient in these areas. That's because it was always far more cheaper than butter, or just a lot more flavorful than lard. The ideal material for frying. The fried bread was also a good way for people to stretch meals, and although some people didn't vibe with the overly gamey taste, back then, it was considered a standard of most red meat-based meals. Sweet potato hash browns were the colorful alternative to regular breakfast potatoes, bringing Thanksgiving flavors to the morning table. Grandmothers shredded raw sweet potatoes by hand using box graters, creating orange strands that were squeezed dry in kitchen towels. The shreds were mixed with diced onions, salt, black pepper, and sometimes brown sugar. Cast iron skillets were heated with bacon grease until shimmering. Then the mixture was pressed down firmly. The hash browns cooked slowly, developing a golden crust before being flipped. The result was sweet, savory, and satisfying, with caramelized edges that crunched between teeth. These appeared on breakfast tables throughout November. Children initially suspicious of the orange color quickly became converts after tasting the caramelized sweetness. Sweet potato hash browns represented resourcefulness, turning a dinner ingredient into something breakfast-worthy. Barley breakfast porridge is this incredibly wholesome dish with a supremely nutty flavor. So it has this really satisfying texture that just feels like you're almost dipping your hooks into a custard, right? But it's also something that can be made to resemble kheer if you've ever had it. It can be made from hulled barley or pearl barley, but depending on which, you get an entirely different flavor merry-go-round. The combination is something that screams cottagecore. Historically, barley porridge really was a cottagecore too. It was a popular breakfast for people who were in rural areas, immigrant communities, and people who lived on the fringes of civilization, especially during winters, when barley was something that everybody was investing in, from the mountains to the cities. Barley breakfast porridge isn't something that's really all that common anymore. It's been overshadowed by oats, granola, and the convenience of all the pre-packaged instant cereals of today, but there's a place for it still. You can cause that comeback yourself by sharing your own take on the barley breakfast porridge. Boiled wheat berries and sugar syrup porridge is something that's the kind of breakfast that just transports you through time. It takes you back to a world where everything is made from scratch. There's no back of the label you have to read, and the phrase pre-packaged isn't something your kids know yet. Nothing went to waste, everything was fresh, it was what Cartoon Network made you think the world was going to be like. Or those Disney and Ghibli movies, just anything with a hint of soul, you know? The wheat berries were really exquisite too, the ideal thing for putting somebody in a food coma. Flavor-wise, this is as rustic and comforting as it gets. The wheat berries have a very nutty aroma to them, an incredibly chewy texture, and the syrup is something that gives a very nice sweetness. It makes the dish feel like a wonderful treat without really doing too much, and the syrup is something that really adds to that. It's one of those breakfasts that really makes a cold morning into a scene ripped right out of some indie film. The porridge was something that peaked in popularity throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and that was especially true for rural households where wheat was very cheap and accessible. Today, it's a nostalgic recipe you find in ancient cookbooks, but it's worth making. Applesauce toast with nutmeg was the frugal breakfast tucked inside every homemaker column and Depression-era guide when groceries ran low but mornings kept coming. You would toast a slice of bread, smear it with applesauce, sprinkle a little nutmeg on top, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. It was practical, filling, and sweet enough to feel comforting when everything else felt stretched thin. Families leaned on meals like this when fruit was scarce, budgets were tight, and creativity had to carry the kitchen. Applesauce lasted longer than fresh fruit, nutmeg added warmth, and toast turned it all into a quick meal that actually filled you up. It was not fancy, but it worked, and you could find it everywhere from farm kitchens to city apartments. Some folks added butter, others kept it plain, but either way, it was one of those quiet little breakfasts that made hard mornings feel a little easier. These days, applesauce toast barely gets a mention, but back then it quietly carried families through. Apricot almond granola bars signaled the arrival of homemade granola into American kitchens during the 1960s, when health food culture began to flourish. Rolled oats were mixed with chopped dried apricots, sliced almonds, and a drizzle of honey, then baked until golden and slightly crisp, filling the kitchen with a warm, nutty aroma. These bars provided natural sweetness, plant-based protein, and satisfying crunch, making them a perfect grab-and-go breakfast for busy mornings or after-school snacks. Unlike store-bought cereals, they allowed full control over ingredients, appealing to families seeking cleaner eating without added preservatives. Many home cooks experimented with different dried fruits such as figs or raisins, and even added a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg for extra flavor. Wrapped individually, these bars traveled well in lunchboxes and picnic baskets, becoming a practical and tasty staple. Apricot almond granola bars captured the optimistic experimentation of the decade, turning wholesome pantry items into a portable breakfast that felt both rustic and delightfully modern. Canned peaches over cottage cheese was the dish that blurred the line between breakfast and 1950s diet food. You would open a tin, let that sweet syrup drip, and gently plop a golden peach half on top of a scoop of cottage cheese. No cooking, no seasoning, just sweet and salty, soft and curdled. It was strangely elegant in a plastic plate sort of way. You might have seen it at church potlucks, cafeterias, or grandma's house, where the fridge always had a cold can ready to go. Cottage cheese was sold as a health food, high in protein, low in guilt. Peaches made it feel like a treat. Add a sprig of mint or a maraschino cherry, and you had something that vaguely resembled a sundae. It was also incredibly practical. No waste, no mess, and it looked prettier than it had any right to. But let us not pretend kids were lining up for it. This was adult breakfast. Quiet, efficient, and undeniably retro. If you ever sat at the table pushing canned peaches around with your spoon while your parents read the paper, you are definitely part of a very specific club. But even this was nothing compared to the boldest fish-forward move of the morning. Buttermilk cornmeal. Griddle cakes carried the warmth of Southern kitchens into a decade eager to celebrate regional flavors with a wholesome twist. Whole grain cornmeal gave these cakes a gentle crunch and rich yellow hue, while tangy buttermilk kept the interior tender and moist. Cooked on a hot cast iron griddle, they developed a lightly crisp edge that paired beautifully with a drizzle of warm maple syrup or a spoonful of fruit preserves. Many families found them heartier than traditional pancakes, offering natural fiber and a subtle nutty flavor that satisfied appetites well into the morning. Newspaper food sections highlighted the recipe as an ideal way to enjoy old-fashioned flavor while keeping an eye on modern nutrition, encouraging cooks to serve them with fresh berries instead of heavy butter. Weekend breakfasts often featured stacks of these golden cakes accompanied by a pot of strong coffee and lively conversation, proving that tradition and health could meet in one delicious meal without compromise. Quick cornmeal. Mush was one of those Depression-era breakfasts that showed up in every rural cookbook and farmhouse kitchen when groceries ran low, but mornings still demanded something hot and filling. You would stir cornmeal into boiling water, cook it down to a thick, creamy consistency, and top it with butter, syrup, or even just a pinch of salt. Breakfast was done in 10 minutes flat, and somehow it stuck with you for hours. Families loved it because cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and stretched into a satisfying meal without much effort. Some folks called it polenta, others called it mush, but it always worked the same: practical, no fuss, and surprisingly comforting. It filled bellies through winters, long work days, and school mornings when cereal was not an option. You could find versions of this recipe in old homemaker magazines, church fundraisers, and even government pamphlets reminding families how to get by with less. It is one of those breakfasts that quietly disappeared, replaced by boxed mixes and quick-fix meals. But back then, it kept people going. Turnip greens and cornmeal dumplings are a dish that confuses you. Is this survival food? Is this a nice little experiment with dumplings and vegetables? It feels like both. It was actually used in both ways too, so you would be pretty spot on with that assessment. See, people love to have fun with the things they did back then, even if those things were rooted in practicality and optimization. The turnip greens were something you simmered slowly, taking pleasure in the little things in life. You would absorb all the scents, fragrances, and aromas, and honestly, just doing that would kill most of your hunger. Plus, when they would get ready, they would turn silky and dark, and they had this really warm glisten to them. Swimming in a pot liquor broth that was abundant with pork fat, usually from a ham hock, it set the stage for an extremely soulful dish that knows what it's about. The cornmeal dumplings were then thrown into the pot, the perfect addition for something to revitalize your spirits. Soft spoonfuls of cornmeal dough would be mixed with bubbling greens, as they created a perfect Ghibli vibe for you to immerse yourself in. Historically, this is a dish that has been very common in Black and poor white communities. It's easy to romanticize today, but it is also a dish that's rooted in struggle, poverty, and making the most out of very little. Brown sugar bacon was the candy-like breakfast meat that turned ordinary bacon strips into something special enough for Thanksgiving morning. Grandmothers laid thick-cut bacon on rimmed baking sheets, then pressed brown sugar firmly onto each strip. The bacon baked slowly in the oven until the fat rendered, and the sugar melted into a glossy glaze that was smoky, salty, and sweet. The kitchen filled with an aroma that was impossible to resist. The bacon emerged from the oven sticky and crisp, with caramelized edges that shattered between teeth. These strips were dangerous because eating one meant craving 5 more. Grandmothers often doubled the recipe, knowing everyone would want more than a civilized portion. The bacon appeared on breakfast platters but also disappeared as snacks throughout the morning. Children would sneak pieces when Grandma's back was turned. This breakfast represented pure indulgence. Grapefruit halves with honey broil offered a burst of sunshine on the plate, perfect for a 1960s morning when families sought a fresh, vitamin-rich start to the day. Large ruby or white grapefruits were sliced in half, segments loosened, and the tops brushed lightly with golden honey before being placed under the broiler. The brief heat caramelized the honey and released the fruit's aromatic oils, creating a warm, slightly tart, and gently sweet treat. This preparation elevated a simple piece of fruit into something special without adding heavy calories, fitting the era's growing awareness of healthy eating. Magazines frequently praised the dish for its vitamin C content and its ability to energize a household before school or work. Some cooks added a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg, while others served the grapefruit with a side of whole wheat toast to round out the meal. Grapefruit halves with honey broil captured the mid-century belief that a beautiful breakfast could be both nourishing and elegant, proving that simplicity often delivers the brightest flavor. Egg in a hole was the breakfast trick every old cookbook seemed to know. Simple enough to pull off in under 10 minutes, but special enough to feel fun. You would cut a hole in the center of a slice of bread, toss it in a buttered skillet, and crack an egg right into the gap. Toasted bread, fried egg, breakfast done, fast and filling with barely any cleanup. It showed up in kitchens from the 1930s through the 70s, always tucked between other quick, comforting recipes. Some folks called it toad in the hole, others sunshine toast, but it was always the same idea, a no-fuss breakfast for busy mornings. It used cheap ingredients most families already had and turned them into something that actually made the morning feel bearable. Kids loved it for the novelty, parents loved it for the speed, and nobody complained when breakfast showed up looking fun for once. It is one of those meals that quietly kept mornings moving, long before breakfast sandwiches and drive-through lines took over. Frozen waffles were not always trendy. In fact, in the 1970s, they were barely waffles. They came out stiff, pale, and freezer-burned, and you would shove them into a toaster and pray they did not come out still cold in the middle. Eggo waffles were a revolution, sure, but they were also kind of sad. They were not crisp unless you nearly burnt them, and they absorbed syrup like a sponge that had given up on life. But they were fast, and that was everything. Parents would toss one on a paper plate and call it breakfast. No whipped cream, no berries, just syrup, maybe margarine if it was payday. The commercials made them look like golden magic, but in real life, they were floppy, forgettable, and weirdly satisfying. If you remember struggling to butter a still-frozen waffle, or watching one fly out of the toaster and land on the floor, you already know the deal. It was not gourmet, it was survival. And for kids of the 1970s and 1980s, this was the norm. But waffles were not the only thing you pulled from a box. Some breakfasts came in actual tin cans and were advertised like they had been launched from a cannon. Let's talk crackling cornbread. This is the cornbread that absolutely doesn't mess around. Like, this is the supersonic of cornbread. This is that rugged, crispy-edged cousin of your typical cornbread muffin, and it brings with it all the rustic charm that cornbread is always known for. Cracklin' cornbread has always come from the innovative kitchens of the working class, and this is especially true in the South, where using anything less than all of the hog was considered culinary blasphemy. Wasting fat? You may as well hang up your butcher knife. It was about no waste, and cracklins were a prime example of why that mentality worked. These were gold, and stirring them into cornbread only made them shine brighter. It made the bread a lot more filling and gave it extra protein, and you needed that because if you were coming back from a day of shoveling mud, then you definitely needed something for those muscles. It was a proper lunch though, and it was even better with some fresh greens on the side. Cracklin' cornbread is something that pretty much has faded into the background nowadays, but it was the perfect kind of thing for when you had nothing but a skillet, an empty stomach, and a lot of grit and determination to make something worth eating. It's a 10 out of 10 for a lot of Southerners, and nothing's really changing that. Rolled oats and bacon are a really humble and delicious combination. It does two things very perfectly. It balances the comfort of a cream-heavy dish with the allure of smoky flavors. Now, that's not very hard to do, but I think when a dish makes that work, it's always one for the Notes app. The oats are something you simmer slowly in water and milk. You know, the usual preparation. You have to wait until it becomes completely porridge, though. Stir in these crisp crumbles of bacon, and suddenly the dish transforms into a wonderful savory fantasy. You get to have this decadent texture with just the tiniest bits of smoky aftertaste, and it makes for a dish that just feels like the perfect autumn or winter breakfast. Historically, though, this is a dish that you would actually find more often in the summer times, when people were really trying to stretch out their meals and scraping for protein. Especially in the early 20th century, when rationing meant that almost everyone had to think conservatively about what they were eating and how much of it they were using. The savory oats bowl couldn't ever go mainstream, but I think that suits the quiet nature of the dish. Sausage gravy over buttermilk biscuits was the hearty foundation that fueled families through Thanksgiving morning cooking marathons. Grandmothers started with bulk pork sausage, breaking it into crumbles in cast-iron skillets until the meat browned and fat rendered out. Flour was sprinkled directly into the drippings, stirred constantly until it formed a roux that would thicken the milk. Whole milk was added slowly, creating a sauce that was peppery, rich, and substantial. The biscuits were made from scratch hours earlier, using cold buttermilk and lard to create layers that flaked apart. Each biscuit was torn in half and covered with generous ladles of gravy. This breakfast appeared on tables across the South, where Thanksgiving meant feeding crowds. Men especially loved this meal, knowing it would sustain them through hours of work. The combination created comfort that modern fast food will never match. Cranberry walnut yogurt. Parfaits brought a new sense of sophistication to the American breakfast table as yogurt emerged as a fashionable health food during the 1960s. Layers of tart cranberries, crunchy walnuts, and creamy plain yogurt created a colorful glass that looked as appealing as it tasted. The natural sweetness of the fruit balanced the tang of the yogurt, while the nuts added satisfying texture and plant-based protein, making it a filling yet refreshing option for busy mornings. Many homemakers prepared the components the night before, allowing the flavors to mingle and saving precious time before school or work. Food writers praised this parfait as a smart alternative to sugary cereals, and it quickly became a favorite at brunch gatherings where presentation mattered as much as taste. Variations included a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of homemade granola, reflecting the era's creative spirit and interest in natural ingredients. Cranberry walnut yogurt. Parfaits captured the decade's blend of health consciousness and visual flair, turning an ordinary breakfast into a small celebration. Egg salad on white bread, open-faced, was the speedy breakfast that showed up in every 1960s lunchroom and kitchen guide when mornings were short but something filling still needed to hit the table. You would mash pre-boiled eggs with mayo, salt, and pepper, spread it on white bread, and serve it open-faced. That was breakfast, ready in under 10 minutes, practical, affordable, and good enough to carry you through the day. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries were limited, but eggs stretched far and filled hungry bellies. It was not fancy, but it was reliable, tucked into community cookbooks and school lunch guides that promised quick, no-fuss meals. Some folks added pickles or herbs, others kept it plain, but either way, it turned leftover eggs into something that worked fast. These days, it is rare to see egg salad show up outside of potlucks or picnics, but back then, it was a small, simple breakfast that actually stuck with you. Beef drippings on toast are the quintessential middle-aged dad breakfast, and I'm referring to a really specific kind of dad too. Beer belly, loaded forearms built over a career of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and the ability to fall asleep on a floor in jeans and eat literally anything. We all know the type. Beef drippings on toast were a breakfast that people largely made when they were low on materials for anything else. Toast is nice, but people have been hearing about it for literally centuries and, things just get old. People like to spice their toast up. It's only human. It's pretty much just what you would expect, too. Beef drippings are largely a byproduct of bacon and red meat cooking, and people like to scoop that up and preserve it as much as they could. You could pour it over beans, or just about anything really. It was the kind of thing that would last you through several uncomfortable situations. You know, having to eat the same bland toast sounds pretty uncomfortable to me. It was also not as meaty or greasy as you would expect. It pretty much just tasted like your regular old beef. And this is what helped it to stay a consistent breakfast option throughout a lot of the 1950s and 1960s. Apple cinnamon quinoa bowls were the healthy breakfast that gave Thanksgiving morning nutrition without sacrificing flavor or comfort. Grandmothers cooked quinoa in apple cider instead of water, infusing the grains with natural sweetness. Diced apples were sautéed in butter with cinnamon until tender, then spooned over the cooked quinoa. The bowls were topped with chopped pecans, maple syrup, and sometimes Greek yogurt. The result was warm, satisfying, and surprisingly filling. Families appreciated having a healthier option on a day known for indulgence. The quinoa could be made ahead and reheated, making it practical. Health-conscious relatives loved having something substantial that wasn't heavy. Children were often skeptical but would try it when they saw adults enjoying it. The combination of warm quinoa and sweet apples felt comforting. This breakfast proved that nutritious food could still taste indulgent and feel appropriate for celebrations. Cornbread in buttermilk in a glass. No plate, no fork, just crumble, pour, and drink. Or scoop it with a spoon, depending on your texture tolerance. This was rural breakfast science at its finest, a Southern tradition that turned dry, leftover cornbread into something hearty, tangy, and oddly refreshing. The cornbread, ideally a bit stale, would be broken into chunks and tossed into a tall glass. Then came the buttermilk, thick, sour, and ice-cold. It was a weird blend of creamy, sour, and gritty, but to those who grew up on it, it was comfort in a cup. It filled you up, cooled you down, and somehow made you feel like you were doing something right. Some people added salt, others stirred in sugar. But most just left it as is, letting the bread absorb the buttermilk until it became a chunky, tangy porridge. It sounds bizarre until you try it. And if you grew up in a house where cornbread was made in cast iron and buttermilk was always in the fridge, this dish was second nature. It was not glamorous, but it was filling and cheap. It got you through the day and made use of every crumb. If you ever watched someone eat this and thought, maybe, you are not alone. And if you actually liked it, then welcome to the secret club. But if soggy bread drinks are not your thing, how about cereal with a twist only the brave attempted? Tomato juice and a toasted English muffin was the stripped-down breakfast of every vintage weight loss guide and old cookbook trying to keep mornings fast, efficient, and low-calorie. You would pour a glass of chilled tomato juice, toast an English muffin, maybe spread a little butter if the diet allowed, and that was breakfast. It was basic, practical, and done in under 10 minutes. Back then, this was advertised as a smart start to the day, simple, savory, and filling without much effort. Housewives, office workers, and even students were told this meal would keep you going without weighing you down. It showed up everywhere from hospital diet plans to homemaker magazines, quietly filling bellies long before protein shakes and pre-packed bars took over. The tomato juice gave a little bite, the English muffin brought warmth, and together they were enough to start the day when time and groceries were tight. It is one of those breakfasts nobody brags about now, but it quietly got families through busy mornings without all the bells and whistles. Cucumber and dill cottage cheese cups embodied the cool, savory side of 1960s health food culture with a protein-packed dish that felt both refreshing and modern. Crisp cucumbers were diced and folded into creamy cottage cheese along with fresh dill, a squeeze of lemon juice, and a light sprinkling of black pepper for subtle zest. Served chilled in small cups or glass dishes, this combination delivered satisfying texture and bright herbal notes without heavy fats or refined ingredients. Magazines often highlighted it as an excellent option for weight-conscious readers seeking a filling breakfast or mid-morning snack that provided calcium and lean protein. Some home cooks added diced tomatoes or a touch of chive for extra color, while others paired it with whole grain toast for a heartier meal. Cucumber and dill cottage cheese cups reflected the growing fascination with simple, natural flavors and made it easy to enjoy a light yet sustaining breakfast during warm summer mornings or busy weekdays without sacrificing satisfaction. Kellogg's Product 19 was not just cereal. It was a statement. A beige box with a no-nonsense name, it looked like something you would find in a government ration kit. No cartoon tiger, no marshmallows, just flakes, vitamin-enriched, iron-packed flakes that promise to do everything except taste good. Product 19 was Kellogg's answer to, well, nutrition. A cereal so serious it could only be marketed to adults or kids whose parents shopped like nutritionists. You knew your friend's house was different when Product 19 showed up on the breakfast table instead of Sugar Pops or Fruit Loops. The texture was dry, the flavor was cardboard, but it made you feel responsible. Like eating it might actually make you taller, or better at math. It was the cereal version of homework, and if you had to suffer through it just to get the toy buried in the box, you earned it. But some families did not even bother with cereal. They just went straight for toast. Not with jam, not with butter, but with something far more intense. Bread scramble is pretty much one of those moments of sheer creativity, resourcefulness, and making the most out of things that just would never go together if you were adhering to common sense. It's a throw-together breakfast if I've ever seen one. I mean, you would honestly be hard-pressed to not call this survivalist cooking. It's exactly what you might think it is, too. Torn up pieces of bread that's either a day old at best or several at worst tossed up into a hot skillet. Add some butter and bacon grease, then scramble it up to high heaven with some eggs. People would typically add whatever scraps they could to make the meal stand out a bit more. They'd add leftover ham, onions, and different kinds of herbs, and flavor-wise, just think of it like a bread-based omelet. It actually soaks up a lot of the eggs and fat, so it's definitely a lot more flavorful than you would expect, and it gets the job done well enough from what is essentially a very impromptu breakfast. Probably end up with a nasty case of heartburn if you use this recipe regularly, though. Bacon fat griddle cakes are something that are pretty much just pure, smoky nostalgia. They're the right kind of greasy. They're visually stunning, and they're full of so much flavor that you'll wonder why people stopped making these in the first place. The best part? They're so good to make on a budget. All that's required for this recipe is some flour, milk, eggs, and just a tad bit of cornmeal, sugar, and maybe molasses if you're really feeling like a dessert king. You're going to have got really old school with the griddle. You take leftover bacon grease instead of any butter or oil, and once your cake's shape is completely done, you just slap them on the griddle. What you get for all your hard, strenuous work is a very crispy-edged, savory and sweet pancake that has a lot of smokiness to it. Each bite feels like a crunch, but the exterior is what's really worth talking about. Obviously, you'd expect something like this to have a fluffy inside, but the exterior is just the perfect start to a delicious bite. Caramelized apple and brie crepes were the elegant breakfast that made Thanksgiving morning feel sophisticated. Grandmothers made thin crepes from scratch, whisking together flour, eggs, milk, and melted butter until smooth. The batter was poured onto hot buttered pans and cooked until lightly golden. Apples were sliced and caramelized in butter with brown sugar and cinnamon until tender. Creamy brie was placed inside each crepe along with the warm apples. Then the crepes were folded into quarters. The combination of sweet apples, melted cheese, and delicate crepes was unexpectedly perfect. Families who usually ate simpler breakfasts felt fancy eating these. The crepes required skill and attention, but impressed guests tremendously. Adults loved them with coffee, while children were divided. This breakfast proved that Thanksgiving morning could be refined without being fussy, elevating the holiday with French-inspired elegance. Whole wheat buttermilk pancakes brought hearty goodness to the breakfast table when families wanted the comfort of pancakes without the heaviness of refined white flour. The 1960s saw a growing interest in whole grains, and cooks experimented with blending wheat flour into traditional batters to create a nutty flavor and a pleasant, earthy aroma. Buttermilk added tang and tenderness, ensuring each pancake was fluffy yet filling, a perfect canvas for fresh fruit or a drizzle of warm maple syrup. Many homemakers liked that these pancakes kept children satisfied well past lunchtime thanks to their higher fiber content, which was a talking point in health columns and women's magazines of the time. Recipes often suggested adding chopped apples, sliced bananas, or even sunflower seeds for a crunchy twist, while some adventurous cooks folded in a pinch of cinnamon for gentle spice. Whether served on a lazy Saturday morning or a busy weekday, whole wheat buttermilk pancakes reflected a forward-thinking spirit that embraced nutrition while honoring the familiar joy of a classic American breakfast stack. Peanut butter and banana on toast was not just a breakfast. It was a survival trick hidden in government pamphlets and school lunch guides from decades past. You toasted a slice of bread, slathered on peanut butter, and sliced up a banana right on top. It sounds basic now, but during hard times this was protein, potassium, and energy in one affordable package. Families loved it because it was cheap, quick, and used things every pantry had on hand. The United States Department of Agriculture even recommended it for busy families when money was tight but mornings were busier. Sometimes folks sprinkled sugar or honey over it. Other times they kept it plain. Either way, it filled your belly fast and kept you going. It never made the glossy magazine spreads, but it was reliable, frugal, and good enough to get a generation out the door. These days, breakfasts come frozen or boxed, but back then, a piece of toast and a banana could carry you through the morning. Ovaltine was for people who wanted hot cocoa, but wound up with vitamins instead. You would scoop the brown powder into a mug, add hot water or milk, and stir, and stir, and stir some more, because it never truly dissolved. You would sip it and still find clumps floating at the top. The taste? Malted, vaguely chocolatey, with a lingering aftertaste of health. But Ovaltine was not just about flavor. It was about promises. The box claimed to make you stronger, smarter, and healthier, all while giving off the vibe of a prescription from your grandma. It was especially popular during the 1940s through the 1960s, when anything that could be fortified with vitamins was instantly approved by parents. And if you were sick, forget it. Ovaltine was coming your way whether you wanted it or not. It was like the soup of the breakfast world, supposedly comforting, vaguely medicinal, and always a little too warm. Kids would pretend to enjoy it, stirring it until the top got cold and the bottom got gritty. And if you ever drank it through a striped straw just to distract yourself, congratulations, you are in the club. But for some families, breakfast was even stranger. It came straight from a can and always smelled like regret. Tallow fried potatoes are the OG French fries. They're insanely flavorful. They have that beautiful golden sheen to them, and they're about as crispy as you would want the perfect batch of French fries to be. A lot of that color, vividness, and flavor comes from the fact that they're fried in rendered beef fat instead of vegetable oil. Now, back in the day, and I mean way before the 80s, fast food joints like McDonald's were actually using beef tallow in their fries as well. That was a big part of what gave them that original iconic flavor. Tallow helps potatoes achieve a savory flavor that they would never be able to get to on their own. Plus, this just isn't there today with the modern oils we have. The best part really was the exterior, because a simple first bite was about as close to nirvana as you could get. If you were eating these when you were borderline starving, then you were pretty much about to have the best food experience of your life. Tallow was the go-to frying fat for a lot of American diners and fast food kitchens, and it's just not hard to see why. And then, you ever have leftovers but you don't want to make what you had last night? Sauce is a dish that actually shows you just how much resourcefulness the working class had back then. The nose-to-tail mentality of people was really something that persisted throughout several centuries before coming to a close leading up to the 2000s. This is a dish that was incredibly averse to being typical. It was one of those things that was different not because it wanted to be, or because it was trying to be, but because it just really had to be. The cooked meat was something that was chopped, mixed with different kinds of vinegar and spices, and suspended in a natural gelatin as it cooled down. Served cold, thick, and in delicate little slices, it had a punch that really helped to balance out the flavors of the pork, with a texture that will keep you stimulated throughout the whole meal. This is a dish that shows you all the different flavors the American South really has to offer. Butternut squash fritters brought vegetable-forward eating to Thanksgiving breakfast, turning winter squash into crispy cakes that satisfied like meat. Grandmothers roasted butternut squash the day before, then mashed the tender flesh with eggs, flour, scallions, and warm spices like nutmeg. The mixture was formed into patties and pan-fried in butter until golden brown, creating fritters that were savory and slightly sweet. The exterior crisped beautifully while the interior stayed soft. These were served with sour cream on the side. Families appreciated having a vegetable dish at breakfast. Children who normally rejected squash would eat these happily. The fritters used up extra squash from pre-Thanksgiving cooking experiments. Adults loved them with coffee, finding the savory flavors perfect for morning. This breakfast represented creativity, proving that Thanksgiving vegetables deserved attention at every meal. Muesli-style cold cereal introduced a European influence to American kitchens during the 1960s, attracting health-minded eaters eager for something different from sugar-coated boxed cereals. Inspired by Swiss traditions, this breakfast featured raw rolled oats mixed with chopped nuts, dried fruit, and sometimes grated apple, all soaked in milk or yogurt overnight. The result was a cool, creamy bowl that delivered natural sweetness and a variety of textures without heavy sweeteners or artificial flavors. Dietitians praised its high fiber content and the slow-release energy that kept families full through busy mornings, a welcome contrast to the quick sugar rush of many commercial cereals. Home cooks often customized their blends, adding almonds, raisins, or sunflower seeds depending on what was available, which made it both economical and personal. Served chilled and often topped with fresh berries or a drizzle of honey, muesli-style cold cereal represented the adventurous side of 1960s breakfast culture, combining European elegance with practical American thrift in a single satisfying meal. Which of these old-fashioned breakfasts would you bring back to your table? Share your favorite morning memory in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe so we can keep serving up the forgotten flavors that built this country.